The evening air was crisp as James Hollister, a 65-year-old retired Marine, pulled into the driveway of his quiet suburban home in Austin, Texas. He had spent the day at his usual fishing spot, hoping to clear his mind. But something felt off. His wife, Linda Hollister, was acting strangely for the past few weeks. She had been nervous, distracted, and avoided his touch. At first, James thought it was just age catching up with them, but deep down, he sensed there was more. That night, James sat in his recliner, nursing a glass of whiskey. Linda had been pacing the room, wringing her hands. Finally, she stopped and took a deep breath. "James, there's something I need to tell you." James put down his drink. "Go on." Linda hesitated, her lips trembling. "I'm pregnant." James felt the world tilt. Pregnant? At her age? His first thought was disbelief, but then a darker realization set in. It wasn't his. They hadn't been intimate in almost a year. His mind raced. Who could it be? And then, like a hammer to the chest, it hit him. His son. Michael Hollister, his 30-year-old son from his first marriage, had moved back into the house 6 months ago after losing his job. James had welcomed him with open arms. He never imagined this. James's jaw tightened. His hands trembled as he stared at the woman he had loved for over 40 years. "Who?" His voice was low, dangerous. Tears welled in Linda's eyes. "James, who?" She let out a sob. "Michael." Silence. James stood up slowly. His chest rose and fell as rage, betrayal, and disgust clashed within him. Linda reached for him. "Please, let me explain." But James turned and stormed out of the house. He needed air. He needed to think. 1 week later, James Hollister was dead. The news spread fast in the quiet Austin neighborhood. James Hollister was dead. It happened on a Sunday morning. The Hollister house was unusually silent when Linda walked into the kitchen. She expected to find James in his usual spot, reading the newspaper with his black coffee. But the chair was empty. Her heart pounded as she climbed the stairs to their bedroom. The door was half open. The sight made her scream. James lay motionless on the bed, his face pale, his mouth slightly open. His skin had a strange bluish tint. The untouched glass of water on his nightstand sent a cold shiver down her spine. Linda collapsed, sobbing, as Michael rushed in. "Mom? What happened?" Through her tears, she pointed at the bed. Michael hurried to his father's side and checked for a pulse. Nothing. Linda grabbed the phone and dialed 911. Within minutes, paramedics and police officers arrived. A hushed silence filled the house as they examined the body. "No visible wounds," one paramedic muttered. Officer Daniel Reeves, a local cop who had known James for years, approached Linda. "Mrs. Hollister, when was the last time you saw your husband alive?" Her voice shook. "Last night. He went to bed early." Michael stood beside her, his arms crossed. "Dad hasn't been himself lately." Officer Reeves nodded. "Any recent health issues?" Linda hesitated. "Not really, or just stress." Reeves took another look at James's body. Something wasn't right. The medical examiner arrived and examined James briefly. "We'll need to conduct an autopsy," he said. Linda's face paled. "Is that necessary?" The examiner frowned. "Given his age, we need to rule out any suspicious causes." Michael stepped forward. "It's probably a heart attack." Officer Reeves studied him for a moment before scribbling something in his notebook. The paramedics prepared to transport the body to the morgue. As they zipped up the body bag, Reeves noticed something. James's hands. His fingers were slightly curled, as if he had been grasping at something before he died. Reeves turned to the medical examiner. "Check for toxins. I have a feeling this wasn't natural." Linda let out a quiet gasp. Michael's jaw tightened. James Hollister was dead, but someone wanted it that way. 2 days after James Hollister's death, the results of the autopsy arrived. The official cause? Poisoning. Officer Daniel Reeves sat at his desk in the Austin Police Department, staring at the report. A lethal dose of digitalis, a heart medication, but in high amounts, it could cause cardiac arrest. James hadn't just died, he had been murdered. Reeves ran a hand through his graying hair and picked up his phone. He had questions, and he knew exactly who needed to answer them. Reeves arrived at the Hollister residence later that afternoon. Linda greeted him at the door, her eyes still red from crying. Michael stood behind her, his face unreadable. Mrs. Hollister, Mr. Hollister, Reeves said, I need to ask you both some questions down at the station. Michael tensed. Why? Reeves met his gaze. The medical examiner ruled James's death as a homicide. Someone poisoned him. Linda's face turned ghostly white. She clutched the doorframe for support. Poison? Oh my God! Who would do such a thing? That's what we intend to find out, Reeves replied. Michael exhaled sharply. Fine. Let's get this over with. At the station, Reeves started with Linda. She sat across from him, hands shaking. Mrs. Hollister, when was the last time you saw your husband alive? Saturday night, she whispered. He went to bed early. Did he seem sick? Disoriented? She shook her head. Number. He was quiet, distant. But that was because of what I told him. Reeves narrowed his eyes. What did you tell him? Linda hesitated. Then in a voice barely above a whisper, she confessed, I told him I was pregnant and that Michael was the father. Reeves blinked. That was not what he expected. And how did James react? Tears rolled down her face. He was furious. He stormed out of the house and didn't come back for hours. When he did, he barely spoke to me. Reeves scribbled notes. Did he eat or drink anything before bed? Linda frowned. Just his usual glass of water? Who prepared it? She bit her lip. Michael. Reeves looked up. Michael gave him the water? Linda nodded. Yes, but he couldn't have. Reeves leaned back in his chair. We'll see. Michael's turn. He sat in the interrogation room, arms crossed. Michael, Reeves started, your father was poisoned. You were the last person to serve him something to drink. Michael scoffed. Are you accusing me? He was my father. Did you and your father argue that night? Michael clenched his jaw. Of course we did. He found out about my relationship with Linda. He called me a disgrace, said I wasn't his son anymore. And then he died a few hours later. Michael leaned forward. I didn't kill him. Reeves studied him. You sure about that? Michael didn't flinch. Yes. Reeves let the silence stretch before standing up. For now, you're free to go, but don't leave town. As Michael walked out, Reeves knew one thing for sure. Somebody was lying. Detective Daniel Reeves sat at his desk, staring at the files in front of him. James Hollister was poisoned. The suspects, his wife and son, both had a motive, both had access, but only one had murder in their heart. Reeves leaned forward, flipping through James's medical records. Digitalis, the poison that killed him, wasn't just any toxin. It was a heart medication, and James had been prescribed it months before his death. That meant the killer didn't need to buy anything suspicious. The poison was already in the house, and there was more. Reeves had just received the results of James's will. It had been changed 2 weeks before his death. Reeves returned to the Hollister residence later that afternoon, search warrant in hand. Linda and Michael sat in the living room, tense and silent. We need to search the house, Reeves announced. Medical evidence suggests James was poisoned with his own heart medication. If those pills are missing, that's a problem. Linda looked shocked. Go ahead. We have nothing to hide. Michael, however, shifted uncomfortably. Reeves and his team searched James's bathroom cabinet. The pill bottle was there. But when they checked the contents, something was wrong. Half of the pills were missing. Did James take these regularly? Reeves asked. Linda shook her head. Not really. He hated taking medication. He still had a full bottle last month. Reeves narrowed his eyes. So where did the missing pills go? No one answered. Back at the station, Reeves went over the new will. The original version left everything to Linda, but the one James signed 2 weeks before his death had a major change. Michael was cut out completely. A portion was donated to a military veterans fund. Linda still got the house and savings, but nothing more. That was a powerful motive for Michael. Reeves decided it was time to put more pressure on him. Reeves brought Michael in for questioning again. This time he didn't hold back. Michael, your father changed his will right before he died. You went from inheriting a fortune to getting nothing. How do you explain that? Michael's face went pale. He was angry. He wanted to punish me for being with Linda. And that made you angry, didn't it? Michael clenched his fists. I was upset, yes, but I didn't kill him. Reeves leaned forward. We found his pill bottle, Michael. Half the pills are missing. You gave him his last glass of water. You had access. You had motive. Michael shook his head, breathing heavily. I swear I didn't do it. Reeves watched him carefully. He was lying. But why? Then who did? Reeves asked. Michael's eyes flickered with hesitation. And that's when it hit Reeves. Michael wasn't protecting himself. He was protecting someone else. Detective Daniel Reeves had cracked hundreds of cases, but this one was different. The deeper he dug, the more tangled the web became. James Hollister was dead, poisoned, and his son Michael was lying. But he wasn't lying for himself. He was covering for someone else, and that left only one person, Linda. Michael sat across from him in the interrogation room, eyes darting around, sweat beading on his forehead. He was cracking under pressure. Michael, let's stop playing games, Reeves said, his voice low and steady. I know you didn't kill your father. Michael's head snapped up. Then why am I here? Because you know who did, and you're covering for them. Silence. Reeves leaned forward, his voice sharp. You love your mother, don't you? Michael's face twisted with panic. She didn't do it. Then tell me what happened that night. Michael stared at the floor, rubbing his hands together. Finally, he spoke. I found her in the kitchen. She was crying. She said Dad would never forgive us, that he was going to throw us both out. He had just rewritten his will that day. Reeves stayed silent, letting Michael continue. She was desperate. She kept saying she had nothing left, that she was going to lose everything. He paused, then whispered, She must have done it. It was time to face Linda. Reeves found her in the backyard, staring blankly at the garden. The moment she saw him, she knew. Michael told you, didn't he? She murmured. Reeves nodded. Tell me your side, Linda. She swallowed hard. James was going to destroy us. He called me disgusting, said I was a disgrace. He said Michael wasn't his son anymore. She wiped a tear away. I begged him to understand, but he was furious. He said he would make sure I had nothing. Her hands shook. So you poisoned him? Linda looked up sharply. No, I didn't. Reeves studied her. She was telling the truth, which meant there was another twist to this story, and the real killer was still out there. Detective Daniel Reeves had been sure Linda Hollister was the murderer. The motive was there. The opportunity was there. But now, after looking her in the eye, he wasn't so sure. She was hiding something, but she wasn't lying about killing James, which meant someone else had done it, someone they hadn't considered. Reeves returned to the precinct and pulled up James Hollister's financial records. If James had changed his will, someone had to witness it. Someone had to benefit. And that's when he found it. A sudden withdrawal of $50,000 from James's account, one day before his death. The recipient, Dr. Ronald Keaton, James's longtime physician. Reeves went straight to Dr. Keaton's office. The moment the doctor saw him, his face turned white. Detective Reeves, Keaton said, forcing a smile. To what do I owe the pleasure? Reeves held up the financial record. You received a $50,000 payment from James Hollister the day before he died. Want to explain that? Keaton shifted uncomfortably. It was a loan to his doctor? That's unusual. James was a generous man. Reeves folded his arms. I think he was paying you for something else, Doctor. Keaton. Maybe to change the dosage on his prescription? Silence. Then Keaton snapped. I had nothing to do with his death. Reeves smirked. That's funny because I pulled James's medical records. You were the one who prescribed him the digitalis. Keaton broke. All right. Yes, I adjusted his prescription, but I only did it because he asked me to. Reeves narrowed his eyes. Why would a man ask for a higher dose of poison? Keaton hesitated, then whispered, because he knew what Linda and Michael had done, and he wanted revenge. Reeves sat in stunned silence. James hadn't been murdered. He had set up his own death. He knew about the affair. He knew his wife was pregnant with his son's child, and he wanted to leave them both with nothing. So he increased his own medication, changed his will, and paid off his doctor to keep quiet. James Hollister had killed himself, and he had made sure it looked like murder. Reeves called Linda and Michael in. He told them everything. Linda burst into tears. He wanted to punish us, even in death. Michael sat in shock. We never meant to hurt him. Reeves sighed. The truth is messy, but now you know it. As they left, Reeves looked at the case file one last time. It had started as a murder investigation, but in the end it was something far worse. A man so full of hatred that he destroyed himself, just to make sure his family suffered. And Detective Reeves had uncovered it all. Detective Daniel Reeves sat in his office, staring at the case file. The investigation was over, the truth uncovered, but something still felt off. James Hollister had staged his own death as a murder, hoping to ruin his wife and son from beyond the grave. It was a bitter, twisted revenge, one that had worked almost perfectly, but there were still consequences to be faced. Linda and Michael Hollister were free, but their lives would never be the same. Linda sat across from Reeves in the precinct, her hands trembling as she processed everything. So that's it? James really did this to himself? Reeves nodded. The toxicology report confirmed it. He intentionally increased his digitalis dosage over time. It was slow-acting but fatal. Tears welled in Linda's eyes. He hated me that much? Reeves didn't answer. She already knew. Michael sat beside her, his face pale. What happens to us now? Reeves leaned forward. Your father changed his will the day before he died. It left everything, his estate, his pension, his investments, to charity. You and your mother get nothing. Linda let out a soft, bitter laugh. Of course he did, but Reeves wasn't finished. There's more. The law is complicated when it comes to death under suspicious circumstances. The insurance company is contesting the claim. Even though it was suicide, the way he set it up, it might take years in court. Michael clenched his fists. So he wins, even in death? Reeves shook his head. No, Michael. He doesn't win. He spent his last days plotting revenge instead of making peace. And now, he's just gone. Dr. Keaton pays the price. While Linda and Michael were free, one man wasn't getting away so easily. Dr. Ronald Keaton. Reeves personally oversaw his arrest. You altered a man's medication in exchange for money, Reeves told him. That makes you an accomplice. Keaton looked desperate. I never thought he'd actually die. I just thought he wanted to mess with them, make them suffer a little. Reeves shook his head. You're a doctor. You knew what that dosage would do, and now you'll have to face the consequences. Keaton was charged with medical malpractice and fraud. He lost his license and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Reeves closes the case. A week later, Reeves stood outside the Hollister home. Empty now, abandoned. Linda and Michael had moved to another state, trying to rebuild their lives. There was nothing left for them here. Reeves took one last look at the house before walking away. Some cases ended with justice, some ended with closure, and some, like this one, ended with nothing but broken lives and bitter truths. Case closed.